Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Tavern of Tales. So I came across another supernatural encounter. This one is a bit different. Now, never mind where I got it from, but it's about a little boy and his family. They moved into a house that was already inhabited by someone else, or something. Well, enough of the suspense. Let's get to it. Today I'm going to take a detour and tell a story regarding a different encounter. One of the most horrifying or worst encounters that we humans can experience. This story is not a murder mystery, but something just as, or even more terrifying. This is a supernatural encounter, and without further ado, let's get to it. Back in the early 90s, where technology wasn't as grand as it is in today's society, people usually had other avenues of entertainment such as malls, video arcades, blockbuster videos, and all sorts of other things. Not to say some of these things don't exist in today's society. However, during the early 90s to the early 2000s, things were a lot simpler and more fun, in my opinion. And it was also a time where children were able to go outside and play until the streetlights came on. This child was no exception to the fun. However, when this child wasn't out playing with friends, he was an avid video game player, which was his absolute favorite pastime activity. He didn't have a brother to hang out with. He was surrounded by girls with no father and just his mother. So, for him, he'd play his video game more frequently when he wasn't outside, because that was his source of entertainment at home. Well, anyway, one day, the family moved into a big house. Everyone was excited because it was way bigger than the apartment they moved from. The house had a big front and backyard, and the family dog they had was also able to run around and have fun. However, the fun was short-lived because little by little the young boy and his sisters began to experience unexplainable noises at night. Sometimes the floorboards would creak as if someone was walking down the hallway. The children would ask their mother if she heard the noise. However, the mother didn't hear anything. In fact, the mother would often accuse them of making things up in order to stay awake late. Whatever the case, the children would often go to bed frightened by the constant noise. As for the young boy, he would often try to ignore the noise, considering his room was the room furthest away. And unlike his sisters, he didn't share his room with anyone. So he'd either sleep with the door closed until he was told not to by his mother, or he would have the family dog with him. And over time, it seemed to be working. However, whenever the little boy would get up to use the restroom or go to the kitchen to get a snack, he would often get chills down his spine, and he would always feel like there were eyes on him. However, he would see no one around, but it didn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. It got to the point where the children enjoyed being at school rather than being at home, because they would be amongst friends. The little boy in particular would tell his friend about the feeling he'd get when he was alone in the house. However, his friend didn't understand the gravity behind it, because he didn't believe in ghosts. Or maybe by explaining it as such, it was a way to keep the little boy from thinking about it himself. Nevertheless, the little boy would eventually forget all about the experiences at the house when he was at school or out with friends. One day, the little boy was getting off the school bus in front of the house, and he spotted someone staring at him from the window. The little boy ignored what he saw and figured it was probably a friend of his mother. However, upon getting on the porch, there was a note on the doormat from his mother letting him know that she had stepped out and to retrieve the key underneath the mat in the backyard. After reading this, the boy began to wonder if someone had broken in the house. So he went back to get his sisters, and they went to their neighbor's house and waited there until their mother returned home. However, that got him in trouble by his mother for ignoring her instructions. He tried to explain what happened, but his mother was so upset that she didn't hear anything he was saying due to her constant yelling. Little by little, the little boy felt more and more demoralized. He'd often talk to his little sisters as well, and they too felt the same way. It was to a point where the children didn't want to be in that house. The little boy decided to spend a large amount of his time in the little back house in the backyard. Every day, he and the family dog would go to the back house and play the video game there instead of the actual house. However, he'd head back to the main house before it became too dark to navigate through the yard. He'd even be scolded if he wasn't back before dark. Day in and day out, he made that his routine, and he would often feel the coldness and chills the moment he set foot in the main house. The little boy tried to talk with his mother about the house again and again, but it often fell on deaf ears. His mother would often say he was over-exaggerating. More to that, his mother was a party woman, so she'd often be gone and the little boy and his sisters would be home alone. And as long as they would have each other or the little boy had his video game, it was enough to ignore these unexplainable noises. However, one day as the little boy was in the back house, the lights went out. Apparently his mother didn't pay the electric bill. This made the child even more afraid at night. The lights were out for a significant amount of time, so the kids would often walk around with candles. However, the little boy would try not to leave his room at night, because sometimes it was hard to find a lighter and he couldn't navigate through the dark. The nighttime was so terrifying to him and his sisters, and the situation got even worse because during the night, the children were able to hear not only sounds of someone walking around, they also began to hear voices. The little boy would often sit up in his bed due to hearing the voices, but he still tried to ignore it. And even though there was no electricity in the house, the little boy had a handheld Game Boy, so he would often play with that as long as he had batteries for it. However, one night as he was playing his game, the most terrifying thing happened. Right beside him, he heard a whisper directly in his ear. "Get out of my house, now." The little boy jumped and looked behind him. However, he knew it was impossible for someone to be behind him, considering he had his back against the wall. And as he turned forward, he saw something definitely inhuman in front of the doorway. Feeling pinned in his room, the little boy was so scared, but for some reason was unable to scream. And just as quick as the figure appeared, it vanished. Directly after that, the little boy ran to his mother's room and told his mother of the horrifying encounter. The mother had him stay in the room with her. However, she believed the little boy had a bad dream and was still unable to grasp the gravity of the situation. However, the next day, the little boy told his sisters about the encounter. His sisters stayed silent, but it was not the silence of disbelief. They looked relieved. One of his sisters began telling him of her encounters as well. The little boy felt a bit relieved because at least he knew he wasn't going crazy. But he also began to feel hopelessness because he had no way to combat whatever this was terrifying his family. But what he did do was walk with his sisters when they'd go to the bathroom, and he'd make sure they made it to their room. He gave his sisters relief by putting on a brave face. Little did they know he himself was terrified. However, he also began to notice the family dog growling and barking at shadows. The little boy decided to put the dog in the room with him, and over time the activity would go away. However, this was just temporary. One night, as the little boy was brushing his teeth, he began to hear sounds of nails against the wall. The little boy finished up in a hurry and ran to his room and got in bed. However, even in his room he began to hear more and more sounds, and this time it would come from his closet. Suddenly the door flew open, and once again he witnessed another terrifying sight. He was not the only witness. The dog began growling at the closet, and much like the first time, the noise stopped. The next day, his sisters asked him about the noise they heard, and he dismissed it as if it was nothing. However, his sisters knew something was up, and he was just not explaining it. Nevertheless, the sisters decided to let it go and head outside to play. The little boy did the same. However, things only got worse because the phenomenon began to show itself more and more, and the kids got to a point where they'd just sit in silence or in horror, and telling their mom didn't do anything. Although she had began to hear them out more and more, it still didn't help because she spent a lot of time out of the house, and the children would be left to care for themselves. And even more, the lights were still not back on yet, so the children still walked around the house holding a candle. However, a week later, that changed. The mother paid the bill and the lights were restored. However, soon after that, a tragedy struck. The family dog was found unresponsive and had suddenly passed away. The family was devastated, and making it worse, the spooky activity began to increase once more. One day, as the sisters were watching TV, they began to hear noises, as if someone with heavy boots were walking around. The two sisters got up and ran to their brother's room and stayed there until the noise stopped. And later that night, the little boy was sitting in his room and suddenly he heard a whisper much like the first time. "You need to leave. Leave or it will get you. Go to the study room." Although the little boy was scared, he remained calm because he had began to just deal with the noises and the strange activity. And the little boy had no idea where the study room was, so he simply ignored him, put the covers over his head, and went to bed. However, the next day, the little boy decided to return to the back house and play video games. However, when he got there, he came across what appeared to be a person. The little boy stopped and remained shocked, and soon after he realized to himself, "This must be the person whispering to me." And as the little boy looked at the person sitting in the chair, he started to recall what the voice was saying, and upon remembering, he realized this was in fact a spirit. Just then it spoke.
"You and your family should leave before it comes back."
Not knowing what it meant, the little boy went back to the main house. He knew that telling his sisters would only scare them, and he also knew his mother wouldn't believe him. And as he got in his room, he turned around and saw something else, and what he saw was an image he'd never forget. Smiling at him from his closet was a dark and sinister figure looking directly at him. And then he realized, this is what the old man's spirit was talking about. The little boy realized the old spirit wasn't trying to scare him. It was trying to warn him of something else lurking around the house. This thing was more than likely the shadow figure the family dog would growl at. And upon thinking about the dog, something else happened. The little boy's fear went away, and while standing there confronting the entity, the little boy began to feel uncomfortable rage, realizing this thing is the reason the family dog suddenly died. For 2 more minutes, there was a standoff stare between the entity and the little boy. And slowly the entity began to disappear. And from that day, the little boy stayed in that anger. And as he stayed in his anger, he experienced crazy things less and less. However, he decided not to tell his sisters anything. Instead, whenever his sisters would experience unexplainable things, he'd be there to protect them. About a week later, the mother came with some good news. She had found another house, and it was time to pack and move once more. The children were overjoyed of the news. It wasn't that the mother didn't care about what the children were saying. She had been house searching to get out of that house. It seems as though the mother experienced things herself, but didn't want to say it. On the day of the move, the boy decided to go talk to the old spirit one last time. However, when he got to the back house, he began to speak to the old spirit. But the old spirit looked at him, and its appearance changed. The boy realized this was not the same spirit. This was the evil one in his closet. However, the boy held his ground, and as angry as he was, he heard a voice. It was the voice of one of his sisters looking for him and telling him it's time to get in the car and leave. And as she found him, she spotted what he was looking at. The girl was terrified by what she saw, and in that moment it began to rage at them. However, the boy wasn't leaving without his bag containing his video game, so he grabbed his bag and he and his sister ran from the back house. The two went back to the main house and took their remaining belongings and put them in the moving truck and joined their mother. Afterwards, the family drove away, leaving that dark house without looking back. As the family left to start a new adventure, the boy felt stronger after encountering something so vile. And periodically he would wonder what became of the old spirit, and if another family inhabited the house. And if there is, he'd wish them well. As a word of advice, be strong in your most vulnerable state, because even though things get tough, there is always a way to overcome fear. And if you can't, we all understand. Now, I don't know what became of the old spirit in the house. Maybe the vile spirit did something to it. Or maybe the old man found peace after being able to warn the little boy. And as far as the evil spirit, I just hope whatever family moves in has the strength to stand their ground against it. Either way, just be careful, because you never know when it might come back. I hope you enjoyed that. I know I did. Well, if you're interested in more stories, then you know where to find me. I'll be here drinking and talking with my comrades as always. Until next time, friend.